You write in the book, though, about the contrast between irrationality within an individual on the one hand and irrationality within a community on the other. And is this not just an issue of scale? Because while certainly, I mean, irrational beliefs can be transmitted quickly within a community, but it's not as if individuals are immune to their own paranoias or superstitions or other fallacious modes of thought. But maybe this is where um, things like motivated reasoning and the my side bias come in.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. It is germane. So yes, in a sense, although it's not just a matter of scale, there are aspects of collective rationality that are a matter of scale, sometimes called the wisdom of crowds. And one famous example, I think, was made famous by a TED talk. You pull a cow on stage. Literally, the speaker pulls a cow on stage. I forget who it was, and asks people to estimate its weight. And how much does a cow weigh? Beats me. You force me to make a guess. I'll make a guess. And so people write their guess on a slip of paper. They hand them to the front. Someone very quickly pulls out a calculator, does the average. Turns out the average of the 300 or 400 people in the audience is within the correct weight of the cow to like a pound or something uncanny like that. So that is a case of scale where you average people's proximate beliefs and it gets closer and closer to reality. So I think that exists, but that isn't exactly what I had in mind, because if it's just a question of scale, there's also the madness of crowds. People sign on to millennial cults, and entire societies can be under the subject of delusions, like Nazi Germany. I think what is crucial is, together with scale, and maybe even instead of scale, it's having certain norms and rules and procedures that are explicitly designed to push the collective in the direction of greater truth, greater reason, despite the flaws in human nature. So there are things like, now all of them are imperfect, but put them together and they can be better than an unaided single human mind. Things like peer review, things like freedom of speech in the press so that ideas can be criticized, things like demand for empirical testing, things like adversarial procedures where a proponent and an opponent debate something and a audience allows themselves to be persuaded or not. Deliberative democracy, separation of powers, checks and balances. So all of these, unless a community has implemented these rules, they could just become victims of the madness of crowds, the most spellbinding orator, the most viral and attractive theory. It's only if both you have these norms and the norms themselves are explicitly designed to approach the truth. I think it's that is how collectives of minds can be more rational than individual minds. When we contrast the flaws and fallacies and biases of people against our best benchmarks, against our ground truth, these are always accomplishments of the entire scientific, philosophical, and mathematical establishment. Now, again, these rules aren't foolproof, and we know that peer review has problems, and there can be academic cults, scientific personality cults, but the rules themselves have to be subject to rational scrutiny and replaced by better ones when their own flaws are exposed.
And two key terms you bring up in the book that are more aligned with or more relevant to the irrationality of groups rather than the rationality of groups are rumor and folk wisdom. And am I right in imagining that there is probably lots and lots of very fascinating literature in the annals of psychology journals about just why our otherwise largely rational faculties are so susceptible to them?
Yeah, I don't know if it's large, but there are indeed certain kind of folk intuitions that are deeply rooted and that probably were the best that our ancestors could do in a pre-scientific environment. For example, and this is something that has been developed by often by evolutionary psychologists and cognitive development researchers like my colleague Susan Carey,
Who just retired, I saw.
who just retired just last week. Yes.
I
Uh,
actually just interviewed your former colleague Paul Bloom, and we were talking about her work. We also talked a bit about your paper, with the first paper he published. The two of you published it together about language and evolution, and he was telling me, I thought this was very funny that you two were going to debate Chomsky and Stephen Jay Gould, and he was a bit terrified about it. And then Chomsky's back went out, and it just never happened.
well, we did have a public debate with Stephen Jay Gould and Massimo Piatelli Palmarini.
Okay.
It was an associate of Chomsky, and it was Massimo who was the impresario for the famous Chomsky-Piaget debate in the mid-70s. And Massimo's still active, and Massimo had written a paper in Cognition, which captured some of the views of Chomsky. So he was a natural proponent of it, and it was Massimo's paper that egged Paul and me on to write our paper, Natural Language and Natural Selection. But getting back to your question, I think we all, for example, approach chemistry and biology with essentialist intuitions, that there is a kind of invisible substance or core or essence that gives living things their power and their properties. We are teleologists. We think just because, the same way that our own lives are directed by our goals, our plans, our projects, our artifacts clearly are designed with a function in mind. We tend to think that the laws of the universe have a purpose or a goal. And this is an idea that Paul himself has pushed, that we're intuitive dualists. We think that we're composed of minds and bodies which can part company. All of these intuitions, I think, feed a lot of the beliefs that modern science has shown to be irrational. That is, that we have a soul as opposed to thought and consciousness coming out of patterns of processing in the brain, that we have an essence as opposed to being composed of molecular biology, of tiny little gears and springs and magnets, that the laws of the universe care about our well-being or care about anything as opposed to being strictly causal and forward-looking, not causal and I should say determined by the present, not goal-directed. And the mismatch between the view of the world provided by our best science and the view of the world that's built into our intuitions is another source of irrationality. A scientific education consists not just of learning science, but consists of learning folk intuitions, at least ideally.
With regard to this, you mentioned Paul has argued that humans are intuitive dualists. This is when I talked to Chomsky, he said something I thought was very funny. I don't think he meant it as a joke, but he said one way in which philosophy has gone wrong is that philosophers insist on treating everything above the neck differently from everything below the neck. And I got a chuckle out of that. But
yeah, well, he's often made that comparison in particular to as a kind of plausibility preparation for the idea that language and other aspects of the mind are innately organized in the same way that the way Chomsky does it as well. No one would say you learn to have a heart or learn to have a spleen or a kidney. Why do we say we learn to have a language faculty?